RUSI New South Wales is an independent, apolitical, not-for-profit public education institute that, since 1888, has been promoting informed debate on and enhancing public awareness and understanding of defence and national security issues. We are Australia's oldest think tank. We conduct monthly lectures and seminars, issue a monthly newsletter, provide research support through our extensive military and historical library located in the Anzac Memorial in Sydney's Hyde Park, and together with RUSI Australia, publish a national quarterly magazine called United Service, with informed articles addressing the latest defence and security issues.
Please note, this monthly update presents the geostrategic situation as at the 9th of October 2025. Please be aware that these reports are time-sensitive as these are rapidly changing events. Hybrid Warfare in Europe by David Leece. Russia has been conducting hybrid or unconventional warfare against democratic states in Europe and the United Kingdom at different levels of intensity for at least 2 decades. It has employed flexible combinations of military and non-military means short of a conventional armed attack, usually employing agents who enable plausible deniability. Tactics used have included assassinations, especially of dissident Russian émigrés, sabotage of energy and water infrastructure, banking networks and health systems, mass disinformation campaigns via social media, including campaigns to influence election outcomes, cyber attacks, especially on governments, public services and commerce, weaponization of mass refugee migration and encouraging anti-immigrant populism to destabilize governments, cutting of undersea fiber optic cables in the Baltic Sea, thereby disrupting internet and other communications, and jamming European GPS systems, thereby disrupting civil and military navigation, including endangering civilian aircraft. Responsibility for sabotage operations, though, is not always clear. On the 21st of August 2025, Italian police captured a Ukrainian who is alleged to have been involved in sabotaging 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines transporting gas from Russia to Germany on the 26th of September 2022, and on the 30th of September 2025, Poland arrested another Ukrainian also alleged to have been involved. NATO's eastern flank now comprises Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. For part of its length, it is separated from Russia by Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, each of which Russia seeks to use as a western buffer, successfully in the case of Belarus. NATO has strengthened its forward defenses in recent years by establishing multinational battle groups in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. Recurring proposals to establish a NATO no-fly zone over western Ukraine, however, are yet to be taken up, apparently for fear of bringing NATO into direct conflict with Russian forces, thereby escalating the existing conflict there. That said, over the past month, Russia has intensified its hybrid aggression against Western Europe. Russia has probed international borders along NATO's eastern flank with drones and fighter aircraft to assess the nature and speed of the European response. It has also used drones to disrupt commercial aviation at major civilian airports at key times. Approaching midnight on the 9th of September 2025, 19 to 23 Russian drones entered Poland's airspace via Belarus. The incursion triggered a NATO quick reaction alert. Polish Air Force F-16S, Dutch F-35S, an Italian airborne early warning and control aircraft, and a Belgian aerial tanker were scrambled. German Patriot surface-to-air missile systems in Poland were put on high alert. Up to 4 drones and possibly more were shot down by Dutch F-35 fighter aircraft employing air-to-air missiles. On the 14th of September, 2 Romanian F-16 fighters, while monitoring Romania's southeastern border with Ukraine, detected a Russian drone more than 20 kilometers into Romanian airspace. The drone did not fly over urban areas or pose an imminent danger, so the Romanian pilots did not to shoot the drone down, but monitored it until it disappeared off radar. On the 19th of September, Estonia reported that 3 MiG-31 Russian fighter jets entered and stayed in its airspace above the Gulf of Finland for 12 minutes. The Russian pilots acknowledged but disregarded communications from 2 Italian pilots in F-35 fighters, which had taken off from NATO's Baltic air policing mission in Armari Air Base in Estonia, before ultimately being escorted into international skies by the F-35 pilots. Since then, flyovers by unidentified drones have occurred near airports, military installations, and critical infrastructure, among other locations, elsewhere in the European Union. Several European airports have been forced to close for varying lengths of time due to drone activity in their vicinity. These include Copenhagen Airport, the 22nd of September, 4 smaller Danish airports, and Denmark's Karup Air Base on 24th and the 25th of September, and Oslo and Munich on the 4th of October, airports forcing the cancellation of dozens of flights on the eve of a German national holiday. Reconnaissance drones were also observed over critical infrastructure in Kiel, northern Germany, at the same time. While the source or sources of the drones has not been determined and the Kremlin has denied any involvement, at least some of them are suspected of being Russian. Indeed, on the 1st of October, France detained the master and first officer of an oil tanker blacklisted by the European Union for being part of Russia's shadow fleet. The ship is suspected of being involved in the recent drone attacks over Denmark as it traversed the Baltic Sea. Using expensive missiles to shoot down cheap drones is not cost-effective, and would be of very limited effectiveness against mass drone swarms as employed by Russia in Ukraine. Hence, NATO is now considering developing an anti-drone wall of contemporary cheap anti-drone weapon systems along its eastern flank and other borders to better detect, track, and intercept drones violating Europe's airspace. Russo-Ukrainian War by David Leece. The Russo-Ukrainian War, which has been ongoing at various levels of intensity for over 11 years now, and there is still no end in sight. Over the past month, the war has not abated. Russia's nightly missile and drone attacks on civilian population centers have further intensified. In fact, the main observable outcome of Donald Trump's meetings and direct talks with Vladimir Putin so far this year has been a further escalation of the drone war on population centers and vital infrastructure after each meeting. Now halfway through the 4th year of continuous heavy fighting since Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion, Ukraine is struggling with recruiting of frontline fighters and sustaining the levels of artillery, air defense, and small arms ammunition needed at current rates of usage. This is despite its cutting-edge scientific and technological innovation and manufacture of missiles and drones, of which it is now a world leader. Russia itself and Russian oligarchs, however, have suffered under Western sanctions imposed since the 2022 invasion. The Russian economy has been forced onto a war footing, and action is on foot in the West to sell some of the Russian assets seized and frozen in Europe and the United States to help pay for assistance being provided to Ukraine. China and India, in particular, though, are supporting the Russian economy by purchasing Russian oil and other goods. The United States remains the key to resolving the diplomatic deadlock, as it is the only nation with the military resources of weapons, ammunition, and other war material to keep Ukraine in the war. Ukraine's European allies, while promising support, lack the military-industrial capacity to sustain the fighting. Against this background, and increasingly frustrated by President Vladimir Putin's intransigence, President Donald Trump warned Putin in late July that, if Russia did not agree to plans for a ceasefire by the 8th of August, Trump would impose high tariffs on countries breaking the Western trade embargo on Russia. When Trump had not received a satisfactory response from Putin by his deadline, Trump imposed a 25% tariff to begin on the 27th of August on Indian goods sold to the United States on top of a 25% tariff already in place. A similar additional tariff, however, was not placed on China, which purchases more oil from Russia than India does. Presidents Putin and Trump met in Alaska on the 15th of August to discuss options for long-term peace in Ukraine. Putin convinced Trump that no ceasefire was necessary before peace talks commence. Consequently, Trump did not follow through with direct sanctions on Russia, as he had threatened, but continued with the sanctions on India, which came into effect on the 27th of August. Trump also met with President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine and key European leaders on the 18th of August, but the summit yielded few details of what a Russia-Ukraine truce might look like. European leaders continued to seek a ceasefire before talks commence. Notably, Trump signaled a willingness to provide long-term U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine, but he did not explain what form those guarantees would take. Such guarantees have long been seen as a necessity to deter a future Russian invasion. President Emmanuel Macron of France, as co-chair of a European coalition of the willing, announced on the 4th of September that the coalition had agreed to deploy a reassurance force in Ukraine after the war ends, essentially land, sea and air forces, to enforce a ceasefire, and that 26 European countries had pledged to provide troops to the force. The coalition hopes the US will provide air and logistic support to the force, although Trump has indicated that there would be no US troops on the ground in Ukraine. President Putin warned on the 5th of September that any Western troops deployed to Ukraine would be regarded by Moscow as legitimate targets to attack. Concurrently, European leaders also pledged more weapons and financial help, including Patriot missile air defense systems, while the Trump administration approved the delivery of 3,350 long-range missiles, extended-range attack munitions, paid for by Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway. At the same time, Trump delayed further economic sanctions against Russia. Following side meetings with key players assembled for the 2025 United Nations General Assembly High-Level Week on the 27th of September, Trump opined on the 23rd of September that Kyiv could win all of Ukraine back in its original form with the support of Europe and NATO, due to pressures on Russia's economy. This marked a major shift in his position on the war, as previously he had said that Ukraine would have to cede some territory to Russia. It emerged in early October that the US is now considering arming Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles and to share deep strike target data with Ukraine. The US Special Envoy to Ukraine announced on the 5th of September that Trump had authorized Ukraine to carry out long-range strikes with US-made weapons, adding that there are no such things as sanctuaries. This has greatly alarmed Russia, which has warned the US not to go down this path 3 times over the past week. The chances of a truce in the short term, though, still seem remote. As a first step, Russia is saying that if Ukraine relinquishes all of the Donbas, including the Donetsk fortress belt that Ukraine still holds, then Russia will agree to the front line being frozen in place elsewhere. For its part, Ukraine remains unwilling to cede any of its sovereign territory, including the Donbas and Crimea, to Russia. Longer term, Russia is demanding a resolution of the underlying issues that it says led to the war in the first place, namely NATO's eastward expansion towards and up to the international borders of the Russian Federation. It is also difficult to avoid the impression that Putin is using peace talks as a ploy to avoid new US sanctions and, by offering peace terms known to be unacceptable to Ukraine, to avoid meaningful ceasefire negotiations while continuing the war. Turning now to the fighting itself, Russia continues to hold the upper hand in the war on land, but as its spring-forward/summer offensive approaches culmination, it has made slow progress, notwithstanding that it increased the tempo in early August in the lead-up to Putin's the 15th of August meeting with Trump. Ukraine, though, continues to hold the upper hand in the war at sea. Its explosives-equipped uncrewed surface vessels have imposed such damage on the Russian Navy that its ships largely remain inactive in port. With the western Black Sea essentially a Ukrainian lake, and Ukraine's sea lines of communication open to mercantile trade, especially the vital grain exports, Ukraine is not pushing further east. Hence, with slow progress on land and a stalemate at sea, both sides are placing increased emphasis on missile and drone attacks on the opponent's cities and strategic infrastructure. Since early May, Russia has substantially increased the tempo of its now nightly drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, and the tempo increased further in July, August, and September. Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, are bearing the brunt of Putin's displeasure that Ukraine is still defending its territory, and in retaliation for Ukraine's successful drone and missile attacks on Russia, especially its airfields and oil installations. For example, overnight on the 2nd and 3rd of October, a massive Russian air assault struck several of Ukraine's main gas production facilities, in some cases causing critical damage as Ukraine prepares for a new heating season. Russia fired 35 missiles and 60 drones at sites in the Kharkiv and Poltava oblasts in eastern Ukraine. The attack was the biggest of the war to date on gas production. Then on the 4th of October, a Russian drone strike hit 2 passenger trains at a station in Sumy Oblast, northeastern Ukraine, injuring dozens of people. As to the ground offensive, Vladimir Putin claimed on the 8th of October that Russian forces had captured almost 5,000 square kilometers of land so far in 2025, and that Moscow has complete strategic initiative on the battlefield. In fact, the situation is much less clear-cut. Both sides have, and continue to make, territorial gains and losses. Russia overall has had the better of the fighting, but its forces have made slow progress strategically and have done so only at great cost in personnel and munitions. Let's examine Putin's claim in more detail. Part of the reason for the slow progress of Russia's ground offensive is that all along the 1,20-kilometer front line, Ukraine has established close drone surveillance to a depth of 15 kilometers, enabling artillery and drone strikes on advancing Russian forces, whether in small groups or larger formations. Russian progress is largely dependent on electronic jamming of the Ukrainian drones. Over the spring-summer offensive, Russia's highest casualties have been on the Pokrovsk, Kupiansk and Lyman axes of advance in eastern Ukraine, reflecting the prioritization given to these sectors of the front. Ukraine's use of drones has been a major factor in these casualties, which Russian forces seem able and willing to sustain despite limited tactical gains. In northeastern Ukraine, Ukraine's 7-month cross-border incursion from its Sumy Oblast into Russia's Kursk Oblast, which began on the 6th of August 2024 and at its peak had seized over 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory, had ended by the 16th of March 2025, Russia having driven Ukrainian forces from Kursk Oblast. Ukraine now will be unable to use its occupation of significant Russian territory as a bargaining chip in any peace negotiations. Over summer, border skirmishing in northern Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts has seen tactical gains by each side. By the 8th of September, with the fighting continuing, Russia had gained some pockets of Ukrainian territory along the international border in both oblasts. In eastern Kharkiv Oblast on the 8th of September, Ukrainian forces were reported to have made substantial tactical gains to retake Russian-occupied territory and were advancing on Kupiansk, a key communications node then in Russian hands. As to the fighting along the 1,000 kilometers front line in eastern and southern Ukraine, by early June, Russia's spring-forward/summer offensive had made some progress. Since then, the front line has remained dynamic. Each side has made marginal tactical gains at various places, but overall, the Russians have had the better of the fighting and have expanded the amount of territory they control. On the eastern axis, Russia has been seeking to capture all of the Donbas, Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, Ukraine's industrial heartland. Luhansk Oblast is now largely in Russian hands. In Donetsk Oblast, Russian forces have been advancing slowly westwards towards the strategic city of Pokrovsk and to the south of the city towards Donetsk's border with Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. On the 8th of June, Russian forces reached the Dnipropetrovsk border in southern Donetsk, but key parts of western and central Donetsk remain in Ukrainian hands. Importantly, these include the so-called Donetsk fortress belt of cities and towns north of Pakrovsk, which runs in a 50 km north-south line along the H20 Kostyantynivka-Sloviansk highway. Analysts suggest that to seize the fortress belt could take the Russians several years. On the 1st of August, Russian forces captured Chasiv Yar, a key city in central Donetsk, after 16 months of fighting. Russian pressure then built further on Pakrovsk. While Russian forces had closed up to Pakrovsk from the south several months ago, there has been a tactical stalemate around the city, which is not cut off and remains in Ukrainian hands. For months, Ukrainian forces have picked off Russian soldiers by the thousand around Pakrovsk using small drones armed with bombs to tie down a numerically superior force. Recently, Russian troops have been creeping forward probing for weak spots in Ukraine's defenses, and in late July some Russian soldiers entered Pakrovsk for the first time. In early September, Russia regrouped and reinforced its troops in western Donetsk apparently ahead of a new major offensive. Russia has been trying to invest Pakrovsk in a pincer. With the south arm of the pincer in place, over the past month it has focused on developing the northern arm further, but has been halted by Ukrainian counterattacks. So, for the moment at least, Pakrovsk remains in Ukrainian hands. Given Russia's primary focus is in the Donbas, it has concentrated mainly on consolidating its earlier gains on the southern axis. Russian forces have sought to maintain their frontline positions in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts, with their main southern axis offensive operations continuing to be in western Zaporizhzhia, where they continue to assault using small infantry groups together with motorcycle teams. Here they employ a wave tactic, sending 4 to 5 motorcycles to find gaps in Ukrainian defenses, and then follow up with dismounted infantry to consolidate positions. Over the past month, Russia has also employed these tactics in eastern Zaporizhzhia, but to little tactical gain. Russia now holds some 3/4 of Zaporizhzhia, and Ukrainian military analysts estimate that the Russians have accumulated as many as 70,000 troops along the Zaporizhzhia front, plus hundreds of tanks and artillery. In summary, on the eastern axis, the Russian advance to Pakrovsk and south of it to the Dnipropetrovsk border is the most notable change in control of the front line for several months, but analysts say innovative tactics by Ukrainian forces, combining the use of drones and ground forces, have inflicted significant losses on Russian forces and slowed their offensive. On the southern axis, there is a strategic stalemate, as in the war at sea. Israel-Gaza War by David Leece. Israel and Hamas signed an agreement on the 8th of October 2025 which would enable a hostage prisoner exchange and lead to a ceasefire in Gaza. How did we get here and what issues remain outstanding? You will recall that, in a major escalation of the war, and against the advice of the Chief of the General Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, General Yitzhak Zamir, on the 7th of August the Israeli Security Cabinet approved a plan for the IDF to take over and occupy Gaza City. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Gaza City was a Hamas stronghold and capturing it was necessary to defeat the Palestinian Islamist militants. Having called up 60,000 reservists, the IDF launched its Gaza City ground offensive on the 16th of September, an operation it estimated could take several months and would involve 5 divisions. The IDF said this was the next phase of Operation Gideon's Chariots, the ground offensive that it had launched in May, and has seen it take control of at least 75% of Gaza. In fact, the IDF had been carrying out heavy strikes on the city for weeks prior to the official launch, with infantry and tanks advancing through outer suburbs. By the 4th of September, its forces were within a few kilometers of the city center, and had control over almost half of the city. By the 9th of September, the IDF had demolished 50 high-rise towers in the city. It said it would now ramp up airstrikes on Gaza in a mighty hurricane, to serve as a last warning to Hamas that it would destroy the enclave unless the fighters accepted a demand from US President Donald Trump to free all hostages and surrender. Meanwhile, strong international opposition to the Gaza City operation was mounting. Several countries, including Britain, France, Canada, and Australia, announced their intention to conditionally recognize a Palestinian state, and did so at the 80th session of the UN General Assembly in New York on the 21st of September. This followed the UN General Assembly on the 12th of September endorsing the July 2025 New York Declaration on the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and implementation of the two-state solution by 142 votes to 10, with 12 abstentions. Israel and the US were the main states to vote against endorsement. Prior to this vote, Israel blotted its copybook with the Trump administration on the 9th of September when it bombed a meeting of Hamas top leaders in Qatar's capital, Doha, as they were gathered to discuss a new US-sponsored hostage ceasefire proposal aimed at ending the war in Gaza. The strike failed to kill the intended targets, the Hamas leadership. Qatar and the US were outraged. Qatar is a staunch US ally of long-standing, and hosts the main US military base in the Middle East. Further, Qatar with Egypt and the US, had been mediating peace talks between Israel and Hamas. The Israeli bombing appeared to be a clumsy effort to derail those peace talks. Diplomatic events moved quickly thereafter. On the 29th of September, President Trump, with Benjamin Netanyahu standing beside him, announced a 20-point peace plan for Gaza, which incorporated many of the provisions that the European and Arab powers, led by France and Saudi Arabia, had sought. Netanyahu had little choice other than to endorse it. It had been developed, though, without discussing it with Hamas, who many thought would reject its requirement that it immediately release all hostages. To the surprise of many, on the 3rd of October, Hamas said that it accepted several parts President Trump's ceasefire plan, but that some elements of the proposal required further negotiations. Trump immediately responded by telling Israel to immediately stop bombing Gaza, adding that Hamas was ready for a lasting peace. On the 4th of October, Palestinian Islamic Jihad endorsed Hamas' response, saying it represented the stance of the Palestinian resistance. Islamic Jihad's approval was important as it would facilitate and speed the release of hostages held by both groups. Meanwhile, Israeli strikes on Gaza continued, albeit with less intensity, and Israeli bulldozers in the West Bank were seeking to bury hopes for a Palestinian state. Following Hamas' qualified acceptance of the Trump plan, negotiators from both sides met in Cairo with mediators to negotiate implementation details. On the 8th of October, President Trump announced that Israel and Hamas had agreed to the first phase of the peace framework that aims at a Gaza ceasefire and the release of Israeli captives and Palestinian prisoners. Israel would withdraw its troops to an agreed-upon line beyond the main cities. This would facilitate the release of hostages, see map. On the 9th of October, the Israeli cabinet endorsed the first phase of the plan, while Hamas chief negotiators said he had received guarantees from the US and other mediators that the first phase will lead to a lasting, permanent end to the war on Gaza. US administration officials said 20 troops will be deployed to Israel to support the ceasefire, but they would not enter Gaza. There are still 48 Israeli hostages in Gaza, 20 of whom are believed to be alive. The 20 living hostages are expected to be released within 72 hours of the deal starting. The remains of the 28 deceased hostages may be returned in stages because it may take longer to locate them. Despite the deal, Israel has continued its attacks on the Gaza Strip. On the 7th of October, the second anniversary of the Hamas assault on southern Israel, which initiated the current war, Israeli tanks, boats, and jets pounded parts of Gaza. On the 9th of October, these ongoing attacks including an airstrike on a house in Gaza City that killed at least 4 Palestinians and injured dozens more. These continuing attacks underline the challenges faced by negotiators seeking to end the conflict, especially since negotiating the next stage, including the disarmament of Hamas and its replacement in Gaza by an interim civil administration, are likely to be more challenging than the agreements so far reached. World leaders have welcomed the agreement, but experts stress that serious questions remain unanswered about the future of Gaza. Many say President Trump will be critical in ensuring that Israel remains committed to implementing the full deal. A two-state solution is still widely considered well out of reach for now. Houthis and Yemen by David Deasey. On the 29th of September 2025, the Houthis attacked a Dutch cargo ship, the MV Minerva Gracht, sailing east from Djibouti in the Gulf of Aden. The ship was not carrying cargo. The Houthi group issued a statement claiming a cruise missile had been used. Fires were started on the ship, and 19 crewmen from the Philippines, Russia, Ukraine, and Sri Lanka were evacuated to nearby ships by helicopter. One Filipino crewman died from his injuries, and another is recovering from burns. Attempts are underway to recover the vessel. The Houthis maintain that the ship had visited Israel, although there is no confirmation of that. This is the first Houthi attack on shipping since July. While the Houthis have not breached the United States Houthi ceasefire by attacking U.S. ships, their actions do breach the provision that there should be no interference with the flow of international trade. There are as of the 6th of October 2 American Arleigh Burke-class destroyers operating in the Red Sea area. India and Pakistan by David Deasey. Following terrorist attacks in Indian Kashmir on the 22nd of April, India launched Operation Sindoor, attacking 9 terrorist bases in Pakistan on the 6th and 7th of May. A brief war between India and Pakistan followed. Since then, both sides have been absorbing lessons learned in that conflict. Recently, Indian intelligence assessments have indicated that the Pakistan Air Force have begun practicing and planning for air attacks to penetrate Indian airspace through Arabian Sea routes following failure to penetrate Indian airspace along the traditional land corridors. In response, India is rapidly developing an integrated West Coast anti-aircraft missile defense system, consisting of the S-400 Russian weapons with 400 km range, Barrag 8 medium range 70 to 100 km surface-to-air missiles, and the Akash system with 45 km range. This of course will be teamed with manned fighters. The whole will be backed by a new radar system being built in Kerala to provide comprehensive surveillance of the Arabian Sea approaches to India's west coast and southern airspace. The Indian Navy also has significantly upgraded its presence on the west coast, and has said that, in any future conflict, it will be in a position to strike at Pakistan. By 2030, India will deploy 52 new surveillance satellites. This is against the backdrop of thawing relations between the US and Pakistan. The export and sales of AIM-120 advanced short-range air-to-air missiles has been authorized, and there are negotiations proceeding about upgrading Pakistani F-16 fighter aircraft. Meanwhile, considerable rift now exists between the Trump administration and India over tariffs, which were an attempt to force India to relinquish its close support of Russia. America appears to believe that it can separate Pakistan from its China relationship and can force India to reduce its reliance on Russia. As a result, India has abandoned its interest in acquiring the US F-35 fighter aircraft and is negotiating with Russia for local construction of its Russian competitor, the Su-57 fighter aircraft. Seeing the world in bipolar terms will not work with the subcontinental powers. In many respects, Australia is ideally placed to deal with India rather than is the US. Papua New Guinea-Australia Mutual Defence Treaty by David Leece. Papua New Guinea, PNG, and Australia have negotiated a mutual defence treaty to be known as the Pukpuk Treaty. It was approved by the PNG Cabinet on the 2nd of October, and was signed by the two Prime Ministers, James Marape and Anthony Albanese, on the 6th of October. PNG proposed this alliance in its 50th year of independence, and Australia was honoured to agree. It is Australia's first defence alliance since the AUKUS Treaty was signed in 1951. It now needs to be ratified by each nation's parliament. The Papua Treaty provides for the two countries to defend each other in the event of a military attack and allow citizens of both countries to serve in the defence force of the other. Up to 10,000 Papua New Guineans would serve with the Australian Defence Force under dual arrangements. Mr. Marope said it would ensure that Papua New Guinea was safe, secure, and prepared to protect its people and borders. The core principles of the Papua Treaty include a mutual defence alliance, which recognises that an armed attack on Australia or Papua New Guinea would be a danger to the peace and security of both countries. Expansion and modernisation of our defence relationship, including by setting out our shared ambition to establish a recruitment pathway for Papua New Guinea citizens into the Australian Defence Force. Strengthening and expanding defence cooperation through enhanced capability, interoperability and integration. Ensuring any activities, agreements or arrangements with third parties would not compromise the ability of either of the parties to implement the treaty, and reaffirming both countries' absolute respect for our neighbours' sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. The parties said in a joint communique on the 17th of September, our alliance will be grounded in 50 years of cooperation as equal partners. It will build on our unique security relationship, the foundation of which is the kinship between generations of our defence personnel. It will recognize the sacrifices our peoples have made for each other and the cause of peace, and our nation's enduring commitment to the principles of democracy and sovereignty. The treaty will mark the beginning of an historic new chapter between our two countries. It will reflect and deepen the trust we share as the closest of neighbors, partners and friends. Joint military training exercises, better technical interoperability, and new cooperation on cybersecurity preparedness are all expected as part of the new agreement. Hopefully, the Papua Treaty also will see Australia able to use the PNG Defence Force Lombrum Naval Base on Manus Island, which could constitute a vital ADF forward operating base in the Pacific like it did in World War II. Vanuatu-Australia Defence Agreement by David Leece. Australia also has negotiated a more general defence and security agreement with Vanuatu, the NACML Agreement. It was signed on the 13th of August 2025, but it has not been ratified by Vanuatu yet, China having raised doubts about sovereignty issues among key Vanuatu politicians. The agreement emerged after Vanuatu's new Prime Minister Jotam Napate, upon taking office in early 2025, rejected the extant 2022 security agreement for not addressing Vanuatu's priorities, particularly climate change and labour mobility. The new agreement symbolizes a renewed commitment to partnership amid increasing geopolitical competition, notably with China. The agreement was signed by Australian senior ministers, including Foreign Minister Penny Wong, Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles, and Pacific Minister Pat Conroy, alongside their Vanuatu counterparts. The NACML agreement is aimed at enhancing economic, security, and cultural cooperation. The treaty focuses on economic and trade cooperation, labour mobility, maritime security, development assistance and infrastructure. It would see the Australian government pour about $500 million into Vanuatu over a decade to help fund some of its key climate, security and economic priorities, while entrenching Australia's position as the Pacific nation's main security and development partner. On economic and trade cooperation, the treaty supports Vanuatu's agricultural exports to Australia and encourages Australian investment in Vanuatu's infrastructure and tourism. It includes technical assistance to enhance Vanuatu's export capabilities, particularly in agriculture and fisheries, aligning with regional frameworks like the Nauru Agreement about the management of fisheries of common interest in the Pacific. On labour mobility, building on Australia's Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, the agreement seeks to expand opportunities for Vanuatuan workers in Australia, particularly in agriculture and hospitality. Discussions on visa-free travel for Vanuatu citizens were a key focus. though Australia has not committed to this, with ongoing talks about liberalising travel requirements. On maritime security, the agreement strengthens maritime security through Australia's Pacific Maritime Security Programme, supporting Vanuatu's Police Maritime Wing with assets like the RVS Tarkure, a Guardian-class patrol boat provided in 2021 to combat illegal fishing and trafficking. On development assistance, Australia committed $500 million over 10 years to fund climate resilience, infrastructure, security, labour mobility, and budget support, including post-disaster reconstruction following the 2024 Port Vila earthquake. On digital infrastructure, the agreement includes $120 million for 2 data centers in Vanuatu to support e-commerce and connectivity to the global digital economy, countering China's regional infrastructure influence. On the 1st of October, Australia's Defence Minister Richard Marles described the NACML agreement as a challenging and difficult agreement to have ratified, but he still believed it would be signed. "There's an enormous amount of goodwill on both sides," he said.